In the cold, dim corridors of Westminster Abbey, a secret lies buried, hidden beneath centuries of polished stone and well-worn rituals. Imagine, if you will, the biting chill of a February morning in 1870. The air hangs heavy with the scent of ancient dust, a smell that seems to carry with it the weight of 1,000 forgotten lives. The sound of pickaxes strikes through the silence, their relentless rhythm carving into the sacred tombs of kings, their echoes bouncing off the towering Gothic arches. Amidst the shadows, one figure stands at the center of it, Aldine William Ashford. His breath shallow, heart racing, he gazes into a long-forgotten chamber, his pulse quickening with a mixture of dread and curiosity. This room, buried beneath layers of history and deceit, is far from ordinary. The very walls seem steeped in blood, soaked in betrayal. And as the flickering light of his torch dances against the stone, Ashford's eyes fall upon what was once thought lost forever, a tomb sealed so tightly, its contents long shrouded in mystery. Inside lies the body of King Edward the King, whose legacy had been stained by scandal, violence, and the bitter taste of betrayal from those closest to him. History had painted Edward II as a monarch who faltered, whose reign was marred by the cruel machinations of his enemies. But what Ashford was about to discover would rewrite that narrative, exposing the dark underbelly of royal ambition and the twisted rituals that had tainted England's most sacred spaces. In the quiet of that crypt, a shocking truth would emerge, one that no historian had dared to uncover. A truth so grim, so unsettling, it would challenge everything we thought we knew about power, about loyalty, and about the cost of kingship. But before we journey further into the heart of this dark story, remember this. History is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a complex, messy web where truth is often buried beneath layers of myth. And to truly understand it, we must dig beneath the surface. So, if you're ready to unearth the secrets that history tried to hide, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Untold Legacy, where we reveal the stories that have been buried for far too long. Share your thoughts below as we step into the shadows together and uncover what was never meant to be found. To truly understand the darkness Ashford would soon uncover, we must first rewind to a fateful autumn day in 1327. In that year, King Edward II, a towering figure of royal strength and defiance, found himself bound not by chains, but by the webs of betrayal that his closest allies had carefully woven around him. The king, once hailed for his courage and leadership, now lay a broken man in the dungeons of his own kingdom, betrayed not by foreign enemies, but by those he trusted most. Edward II's fall from power didn't happen in the chaos of battle, nor in the face of invading forces. His demise came not with a sword to the chest, but through a far quieter, more insidious betrayal. His own wife, Isabella of France. In a twist of tragic irony, Isabella, once his devoted partner, had allied herself with his political enemies, the very men who had long resented his rule. Together, they staged a coup that stripped Edward of his throne. His wife, once the symbol of royal unity, now sought his destruction, her lust for power overriding any semblance of loyalty. The royal blood that once bound them together now became a thread that Isabella used to strangle her husband's reign. What had driven Isabella to such extremes? The causes of betrayal in royal courts are rarely simple. But in this case, Isabella's reasons were far from innocent. She had grown resentful of Edward's weak leadership and his increasingly notorious infatuation with his male courtiers. His close relationship with Piers Gaveston, a younger noble whom Edward held above all others, had fueled rumors and outrage. It wasn't just political dissension that led to Isabella's rebellion, it was personal. The whispers about Edward's perceived favoritism, the isolation of his queen, and the growing dissatisfaction within his court had all culminated in an explosion of betrayal that shattered the very foundation of their marriage and his kingdom. Edward was deposed, forced to abdicate in favor of his son, the future Edward III. But the worst was yet to come. His death, shrouded in mystery and soaked in blood, was not a natural end. The story of his execution remains one of England's most grotesque legends. Some accounts suggest that Edward was murdered in the most barbaric manner imaginable, a brutal suffocation by a red-hot poker, a fate that had been carefully orchestrated to eliminate the king in the most humiliating and painful way. Whether the truth of his death lies in this rumor or in a quieter execution, the horror of his final moments was only the beginning of a story that would stretch far beyond the grave. The true grotesquerie, however, came after Edward's death. The body of a king, once considered sacred, was no longer treated with reverence, but as a mere tool in the ongoing political struggle. The powerful men who had conspired against him cared less about the sanctity of his remains than about the need to erase his existence. His death became just another chapter in the ruthless game of political maneuvering. No longer was Edward II a king, a father, or a husband. He was an inconvenient relic to be discarded. When Dean William Ashford begins his investigation in Westminster Abbey in 1870, his expectations are simple: uncover the truth of Edward II's final resting place. But what he uncovers is far more insidious than a simple tomb. As he sifts through centuries-old burial records, he realizes that the monarchs who had once reigned with such power were treated no differently in death than they had been in life, subject to the whims of those who came after them. The royal tombs in Westminster were not monuments to eternal glory, but to political expediency. The Abbey, revered as a place of sacred burial, is not what it seems. Ashford uncovers a series of tombs that have been repeatedly disturbed, not by natural forces, but by the powerful hands of those who had sought to control history and the legacy of the monarchy. Edward II's tomb was just one of many royal graves that had been moved, hidden, and rearranged to serve the ambitions of those in power. The bodies of kings were shuffled like pawns on a chessboard, moved to make room for more favorable figures, their legacies buried to make way for others. The tombs that lined the crypts of Westminster Abbey were not simply sites of reverence. They were battlegrounds in the ongoing fight for control of England's history. Edward VI's remains were shifted, concealed, and manipulated as part of a grander narrative, one that painted the royal family as flawless and noble, even if that meant burying the inconvenient truths beneath layers of dust and stone. Ashford's search reveals something far darker than the physical decay of a long-dead king. What he uncovers is the endless manipulation of the past and ongoing game, where the bodies of the dead serve only as symbols, and the truth of their lives, their struggles, and their ultimate betrayal is buried in the deepest, most hidden corners of the Abbey. The royals of England, it seems, were not just rulers, they were symbols of power, to be used and discarded as needed by those who ruled in the present. Edward II was not the only monarch to be treated this way. Ashford's investigation reveals the full extent of the political machinations that continued long after a king's reign had ended. The tombs that had once been hallowed grounds, designed to honor the royal dead, had become a game of political chess, where the pieces were bodies, and the players were those who sought to control the past. What Ashford unearths is not just a physical relicit, is the raw truth of a world where power and betrayal never sleep, even in death. What was once sacred is now tainted, as the game of history continues to be played, and those who think themselves in control of the present become the architects of a past they wish to create, not one that is bound by truth, but by the simple, ruthless desire for power. And in that, Ashford discovers a truth more unsettling than any ghost of a king history, once written, is never as permanent as we think. The discovery inside Edward III's tomb sent a ripple of horror through the quiet, cold air of Westminster Abbey. As Ashford's team carefully pried open the leaden coffin, the pungent stench of death hit them with full force and odor that had festered for centuries, trapped within the confines of the metal. It was as though the very tomb had held a secret far darker than anyone had anticipated, a secret that could not be contained by time or the stone walls that surrounded it. As the lid creaked open, the first rush of air that escaped felt almost like a living thing, a silent scream from a time long past. It was as though the tomb had become a portal to another world, one where betrayal, manipulation, and the brutal grasp of power had reigned supreme. And as the dust settled, Ashford and his team peered inside, their torches casting eerie shadows upon the body that lay there, once a monarch, now a hollowed shell of decay. The body of King Edward II, once a living figure of authority, was barely recognizable. Time, it seemed, had taken its toll on what remained of him. His once pristine royal effigy had become a grotesque mockery of itself, its features distorted by the ravages of time and the neglect of those who had buried him. What had been intended as a resting place for a king's eternal glory was now nothing more than a decaying relic, a stark reminder of the brutality that had surrounded Edward's life and death. The king's body, wrapped in the remnants of royal splendor, had rotted beyond recognition. His flesh, once adorned in regal fabric, had now given way to something far more disturbing. But it was not the physical state of the body that made Ashford's heart race. No, it was the markings etched into the lead casing of the coffin, the mysterious symbols and names, scrawled hastily with what appeared to be crude instruments, names that had been forgotten by history. Some were carved deep into the metal, others were faint, barely legible, but all were unmistakable signs of disturbance. Were these the marks of grave robbers? Conspirators who had come to desecrate the body for personal gain? Or perhaps they were the marks of curious men historians, maybe, who, driven by their own obsession with the past, had ventured into the crypts to touch the dead hands of kings. As Ashford stood there, unable to look away from the unsettling images that played out in front of him, he realized the enormity of what he had uncovered. Edward II, once an iconic figure of English monarchy, had been reduced to something far less sacred. His body had been moved repeatedly after his death, shuffled and relocated at the whim of those who sought to control the kingdom. His final resting place was not a sacred monument of reverence. It was a mere tool in a much darker game of political maneuvering. The body of Edward II had been manipulated long before it came to rest in this tomb. It had been moved, removed, and hidden by those who sought to preserve their own power. It wasn't enough to dethrone Edward. Those who conspired against him had sought to erase him entirely. His tomb became a reflection, not of royal honor, but of royal manipulation, a symbol of how even the dead were not safe from the hunger for control. What had once been a burial site for a king's legacy had become just another chapter in the endless struggle for political survival. Ashford's discovery was a moment of reckoning. The body of a king once, thought to be beyond the reach of history's manipulation, was shown to be nothing more than a pawn in a ruthless political game. Edward II had been discarded, not just in life, but in death, a casualty of the ambition that consumed those around him. His remains were shuffled to make way for more prominent figures, his legacy buried beneath the ambitions of the powerful men who came after him. In this crypt, the truth about the monarchy's brutal control over the past began to unfold, revealing a history not of reverence and honor, but of ruthless, calculated moves to protect the power of those who held the throne. The tomb that housed Edward II was not just a resting place for a king's remainsit. had become a symbol of the monarchy's brutal treatment of its own legacy. The royal family, once considered the ultimate authority, had proven themselves to be no different from the politicians of their time. They had manipulated their own bloodline, erasing inconvenient truths, burying them in forgotten corners, and distorting the history of the very institution they claimed to uphold. Ashford's findings, buried beneath centuries of dust and silence, confirmed what many had long suspected, that the royal family, for all its grandeur, had been complicit in acts of desecration. The tombs of monarchs like Edward II had been routinely disturbed, moved, and manipulated for the sake of political expediency. Even in death, these kings were nothing more than tools in the ongoing struggle for power. As Ashford stood there, taking in the full scope of what had been uncovered, he could not help but feel a sense of unease. The history of England's monarchy had always been shrouded in myth stories of glory, honor, and eternal power. But the truth, it seemed, was far darker than anyone had ever imagined. Edward II, for all his flaws and failures, had been treated no differently in death than he had been in life. His body had been discarded, hidden, and manipulated to serve the ambitions of those who had sought to erase him from history. And in that moment, Ashford realized the true horror of what he had uncovered. The royal family, for all its wealth and power, had been complicit in the most disturbing acts of manipulation. Their bodies, their tombs, their legacies, everything had been shaped to serve the needs of the powerful. Even in death, Edward II had been used, discarded, and forgotten. His tomb a silent witness to the ruthless nature of those who had sought to control not just his life, but his death. The discovery in the tomb was not just about a single king, but about a system of power that had used death itself as a tool for control. The monarchs of England had never been above the games of manipulation, and the proof of that lay in the leaden tomb of Edward II tomb that, in the end, told a far darker story than anyone had ever anticipated. So what can we take from this disturbing revelation about the monarchy's treatment of history? The truth is far darker than the grand legends built around these kings. The royal family was not immune to the corrupting influence of power. Their bodies, once considered sacred, were reduced to mere pawns manipulated for political gain, moved for convenience, and desecrated for the ambitions of those in power. Their legacies were twisted, their names used to justify the brutal actions of those who sought to maintain the throne. The true tragedy of this story lies not just in the grotesque decomposition of the king's body, but in the deeper, more unsettling lesson about how power operates even after death. The royals we honor in history were not always paragons of virtue. In fact, many were as human as we are, driven by ambition, ego, and an unquenchable thirst for power. Their remains might be buried in grand tombs, but their legacies are often manipulated and distorted for the benefit of those who followed them. As we reflect on this, we must ask ourselves, how much of the history we believe is really just a carefully crafted illusion? How many parts of the past are we still hiding from ourselves, just as the kings of old sought to bury harsh truths beneath layers of marble and lead? We've been taught to revere these figures, to glorify their reigns and celebrate their triumphs. But at what cost? The history we know has been shaped by those who had the power to write it. And too often, the stories we cherish are not the true ones, but the ones that serve the purposes of the present. This isn't just a story about dead kings. It's a story about how we continue to manipulate and reshape our own history to fit our ideals. What parts of the past are we still covering up today, and why? The tombs of Edward II and his royal counterparts remind us that those who wield power are never content to leave the truth untouched. They will shape it, control it, and erase it if it threatens their hold on the present. And perhaps in this very act, they have done more than manipulate history. They've taught us to question what we know, to dig deeper, and to never accept the surface story. As you stand in the shadows of Westminster Abbey or in the presence of any historical monument, remember that beneath the stone lies not just the weight of the past, but the ghosts of manipulation, of power, and of those who sought to bury the truth beneath layers of gilded lies. The question we must ask now is simple. What are we still hiding from ourselves? What truths have we yet to unearth, and at what cost? The real horror of history is not that the past has been buried, it's that it's still being written. And the more we choose to ignore its darker corners, the more we risk allowing the same cycles of power and corruption to continue. So as we've seen, the story of Elizabeth Ibb's final resting place is far more than just a history lesson. It's a powerful reminder that even the most powerful figures eventually succumb to time, and that the way we treat the dead often reflects more about ourselves than those who have passed. It's a sobering look at the messy, often undignified reality that lies beneath the polished surface of history. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this. What surprised you most about Elizabeth's story? Do you have any questions about royal burial practices, or perhaps know of similar historical anecdotes? Leave a comment below. I'm eager to hear from you and get a discussion going. If you found this journey into the depths of Westminster Abbey fascinating, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on future explorations of history's hidden corners. And if you're eager to delve even deeper into the mysteries surrounding Elizabeth and the secrets of Westminster Abbey, be sure to check out Part 2. We'll be uncovering even more intriguing details and exploring some of the lasting legacies of this remarkable queen. Thanks for watching.